the feathered dispatch of the Lost Battalion. The rumor, thin and poisonous, began not with a shell burst or a distant whistle, but with the rustle of dry oak leaves underfoot. It was the whisper of friendly fire. In the dense, echoing hollows of the Argonne forest, October 1918, there was no front line, only a perpetual, suffocating gray. Private First Class Elias Thorne, 20 years old and tasting more metallic dust than food, pressed his back against the damp earth of a shallow, shell-cratered ravine. Above him, a makeshift canvas tarp offered scant protection from the drizzle and the constant, unnerving shriek of incoming artillery, their own artillery. Elias wasn't a rifleman, he was a signaller, a member of the U.S. Army's 77th Division, the famed Liberty Division composed primarily of men from New York City. For the last 2 days, his world had shrunk to a muddy, 400-yard perimeter occupied by nearly 600 desperate American soldiers, led by Major Charles Whittlesey. They were pinned down, cut off, and surrounded by German machine gun nests. Worse, their own commanders, believing the 77th had advanced further, were systematically shelling their position. "They think we're still in the clear," whispered Sergeant Rizzo, spitting a mouthful of mud. "They think they're supporting the push. We're getting hammered, Thorne. We're the lost ones." Elias looked at the radio receiver, a heavy, intricate piece of technology that lay silent and useless. Wires were cut, batteries were dead, and the thick, wooded canopy rendered long-range wireless communication a fantasy. They had tried human runners, but the forested gauntlet of German mortars and snipers had swallowed every single one. No message had gotten out. No word of their precise location had reached the divisional headquarters. Whittlesey appeared, his uniform torn and smeared, his face a map of exhaustion. He looked at Elias, then toward the crude cage nestled beneath a stump, the last hope. Inside, 3 homing pigeons huddled. 2 were still strong, but the third, a dark Czech cock pigeon named Cher Ami, French for dear friend, was the unit's pride, their most reliable messenger, reserved only for terminal emergencies. "Thorne," the major rasped, his voice raw. "Prepare Cher Ami. This is the last attempt. Tell them, Ravine 244, grid reference 186. We are being bombarded by our own guns. We cannot hold out much longer." The sheer irony was agonizing. To survive the Germans, they first had to survive the Americans. Elias gently reached into the cage. Cher Ami cooed, a soft, almost domestic sound utterly foreign to the deafening industrial cacophony of war. Elias carefully took the aluminum capsule from his pocket. The message, scrawled on onion skin paper in Whittlesey's trembling hand, was tiny but world-altering. He slipped the scroll into the leg capsule, crimped it shut, and paused, holding the bird close. He could feel the tiny, rapid beat of its heart, a machine of life and navigation, about to fly into an inferno. "Okay, my friend," Elias murmured, his lips dry. "Go home." Reaching the crest of the ravine was a commitment to suicide. Elias had to expose himself fully to the ridge, a deadly stretch of ground where the German machine gunners had perfected the art of crossfire. "Cover fire!" Rizzo screamed. A ragged volley of rifle fire erupted from the ravine. Elias sprinted, his boots slipping on the slick clay. He gained the open ground of the ridge, dropped to one knee, and hoisted Cher Ami high above his head. The German fire was immediately drawn to the movement. A burst of bullets chipped the tree line next to him, showering his face with splinters. Cher Ami, accustomed to the drill, needed no urging. With a powerful, effortless beat of its wings, the bird launched into the air, spiraling upward, instinctively seeking the highest, clearest path home, back to the divisional loft, 30 miles to the rear. For a terrifying, exhilarating second, the pigeon was a small, graceful blur against the angry gray sky, rising above the smoke and the chaos. It was the only clean thing in the entire godforsaken forest. Then, the Germans shifted their focus. For them, the pigeon wasn't just a bird, it was a living weapon, the ultimate countermeasure to their encirclement. If it flew, they had failed. Elias, still kneeling, watched in horror as the sky around the pigeon erupted. The distinct, tearing sound of a German rifle cracked, closer and clearer than any other shot. Cher Ami jerked violently in midair. For a sickening moment, the bird tumbled, feathers scattering like ash, its flight path disintegrating into a sickening, fatal drop. "No!" Elias yelled, forgetting the risk of his own exposure. The pigeon, however, didn't fall. In one of the most surprising acts of sheer biological will Elias would ever witness, the tiny creature righted itself. It gave a desperate, powerful thrust with its remaining functional wing and resumed its course, albeit flying lower and slower. It disappeared over the eastern ridge, a dark, wounded arrow aimed at the American lines. Elias scrambled back down into the pit, his lungs burning, his hands shaking. He had witnessed a miracle, but he couldn't know if the miracle was complete. Had it made it over the ridge? Was it flying in the right direction? Was the capsule intact? For the next 4 agonizing hours, the bombardment continued. The ravine was a cauldron of fear and exhaustion. Men prayed, wept, and tried to dig deeper into the earth. The incoming shells were now a steady, measured metronome of death, tightening the noose. Then, just as the sun began its murky descent and the German fire intensified, it stopped. The silence was heavier than the noise had been. It was not a temporary lull, it was a deliberate, total cessation of American fire. The men looked at each other, confused, afraid to believe. Had the Germans captured their own lines? A few hours later, the ground began to vibrate with the heavy, rhythmic beat of American boots. A new sound joined the terrifying orchestra of the forest, the shouted commands of U.S. officers. The siege was broken. The 77th Division was pushing through the German lines, having pinpointed the exact location of the Lost Battalion. They were saved. Elias Thorne didn't get to celebrate with the rest of the unit. He was immediately detailed to a medical post 30 miles back. The message, it turned out, had arrived at the Signal Corps loft barely 30 minutes after Cher Ami had been spotted falling. Elias found the Pigeon on a medical table, attended by an army veterinarian. Cher Ami was alive, but barely. The bird had flown for nearly 25 minutes, covering 30 miles while taking a direct hit. "It's a wonder he made it," the vet said, shaking his head. Elias approached the table. Cher Ami had been shot through the breast, and a significant amount of blood had saturated the surrounding feathers. But the worst injury was to the leg that had carried the vital message. A bullet had shattered it. "Did the message get through?" Elias asked, his voice cracking. "Clear as a bell," the vet replied, looking at the Pigeon with profound respect. "Your boys are marching out of that hellhole now. This bird saved over 500 lives." Elias watched as the vet carefully worked to save the bird, but the leg was too far gone. It had to be amputated. Cher Ami survived the procedure and, a few weeks later, was fitted with a tiny wooden leg. Cher Ami, the pigeon who had refused to fall, became the most decorated animal of World War I. For its extraordinary service and bravery, the Pigeon was personally decorated by General John J. Pershing with the Croix de Guerre with a palm. Elias Thorne never forgot the sight of the Pigeon correcting its trajectory mid-air, a silent, feathered promise kept under fire. The war was full of heroism, the charge of the infantry, the steadfastness of the artillerymen, but in the desperate, mechanical brutality of the modern battlefield, it was a creature of ancient messaging that proved the most reliable, the most tenacious, and ultimately, the most heroic of them all. He had learned a powerful, surprising truth in that muddy ravine: sometimes, the smallest instrument of war carries the greatest capacity for salvation, proving that courage isn't measured by height, weight, or even species, but by the relentless flight toward home.